Hey guys, I am Alex Nye. I'm an architectural photographer based in Santa Barbara, and if you're watching this, then I probably already spoke with you through phone or email. And so with this video, I want to kind of walk you through the process that I usually take and explain the techniques I like to use and the preferences I have when it comes to using Lightroom and Photoshop to edit my photos. So I'll try to make this as quick as I can. I'll try to hit the most essential points and go from there, and then answer any questions you might have afterwards. So thanks for taking the time to watch this video. I really hope our relationship works out together. Thanks. So to summarize the kind of look and feel that I'm going for with my photos, overall, I'm looking for an elegant and natural blend of exposures using manual compositing techniques, using custom masks to balance light and color temperature, neutral but not stale, dramatic but not oversaturated. In my photos, I don't really like to see clipped or blown out highlights, with the exception of small specular light sources, of course. Obviously, within reason, I want everything to look natural. I also try to avoid overly saturated white balance color casts. Blues from interior windows and daytime shadows, also gross yellow and oranges from artificial light sources. Don't get me wrong though, I don't want everything to be completely neutral and colorless. I just want the colors to be very natural and intentional. For interiors, I typically prefer slightly more high key, a slightly brighter photo, as well as more neutralized colors and neutralized whites and grays without having totally blown out light. Windows will almost always become traced with a pen tool or similar to recover whatever detail was outside the window. All right, so let's jump into the editing process. So first, I always start in Lightroom or Bridge if that's what you prefer. With raw files. So typically I will provide you with anywhere from 3 to 11 bracketed exposures for every area of light. In addition, I might have a few extra photos accounting for people or other subjects that I might want to have included into that final composite. Interiors might have additional exposures for different bursts of flash or light painting, but we'll sort of address that down the road. You won't necessarily need to use all the layers I provide, but they're there just in case. I try to use very minimal Lightroom edits before bringing the layers into Photoshop. In my experience, I found that by stretching a single raw file in Lightroom really degrades the quality as well as its realism or natural look that it has when you get it straight out of camera. For this reason, I keep my actual Lightroom adjustments very minimal. So the only adjustments that I typically make in Lightroom are this. For every single raw file, I check the box to remove chromatic aberration. I then raise the noise reduction to about 20 or so and raise the sharpening to about 50 or so before bringing it into Photoshop for compositing. Those two are always going to happen. So as I did for my workflow, I recommend making a preset for them, and then you can quickly click on that and apply it to all the layers. The next thing I address is the highlights and the shadows. It's typically somewhere around plus minus 35. I wouldn't really go higher than 50, depending on the situation, if it calls for that. Finally, the last thing to consider while you're still in Lightroom is white balance. I typically have my camera locked into a daylight white balance for my entire day of shooting, but that often needs to be adjusted to look more accurate. You can try finding a solid gray area in the frame, use the color picker. If there is no gray area, just try to judge it the best you can by your eye so that it looks natural. Not every photo though will need its white balance adjusted, but keep an eye out for it. I personally think that everything else looks better when you do it in Photoshop. So that's kind of where I leave it. I don't go any further than that in Lightroom. Now I will quickly say there's certain occasions when you need to stretch one single raw exposure in one direction or another. For example, if there's a tree that sort of blows in the wind and then those those bracketed exposures don't line up. In those cases, you would want to address, make virtual copies of it, raise the exposure by 2/3 of a stop increments up and down, and then use those layers to make your composite for that particular area. Okay, this is super important. Please never crop or make transform adjustments. I need to be able to drop layers into your edited document and have them align perfectly. I will do the perspective correction and cropping as the last step in the workflow once all the compositing and retouching is finished. Okay, so from there, we're ready to open all of those photos in Photoshop as layers. So the first thing I always do in Photoshop is just quickly double check to see if the layers are aligned. Small chance my tripod was bumped, in which case you'll want to auto align the layers. So first thing in Photoshop, I always make a curves layer with a subtle contrast to put at the very top of everything. I keep that layer active all the time and slightly adjust it as necessary. I recommend making a Photoshop action that will make this layer, name it, and remove the mask, and you can click that once. So looking at the bracketed photos, I choose one of the middle exposures to use as my base layer. Put that at the bottom of the stack, and then everything else goes into separate folders: highs, lows, people, extras, adjustments. You can use any folder names that you like as long as it makes sense to me. So a few quick notes that I want to mention before we start editing in Photoshop. What I'm looking for from you guys is a TIFF file that preserves layer data so that I can open the Photoshop document that you create and make my own sort of fine-tune adjustments. For this reason, it's important to work as non-destructively as possible. Using masks, you use adjustment layers, etc. For exteriors, in almost every case, I will want to have control over the sky. That's typically one of the first selections that I make. Depending on the situation, I either start with the pen tool or select color range. You'll need to selectively add and subtract from that selection to get a perfect sky selection. So if I start with selecting color range, I almost always have to trace along the horizon edge with the pen tool to eliminate any of the selection that spilled onto the foreground. Also, remember to name and save your pen tool selections in case that I want to use them again later on. Typically for exteriors, I like bringing the sky down in exposure by a stop or two. This isn't always the case, but it's pretty common that the sky will be more overexposed than the rest of the photo, and I like to draw attention a little away from the sky and more to the building in the foreground. So this isn't always the case, but pretty often I like to create a subtle gradient in the sky with the top of the frame being a little darker. Okay, so from there I begin to selectively mask the high and low exposure layers to evenly balance the light. It doesn't matter exactly what techniques you use to achieve this, as long as the final result looks natural. I don't like the flatness that occurs when you apply HDR or when the image kind of loses its natural contrast. Just be careful not to create mushy areas with unrealistic contrast. This is why I tend to prefer masking areas selectively. So not only am I looking for each area of the photo to be well exposed, but I also want to intentionally use light to direct the viewer's eye through the photo and emphasize the most relevant parts of it, and to draw attention away from the undesirable parts. So for example, to establish hierarchy, you might want the building itself to be slightly brighter than the area around it or the background or the foreground. Whenever there's pavement, I almost always drop it down in exposure by a stop or two. If there's distracting buildings in the foreground, I often bring them down in exposure to make them less noticeable. Hey guys, I'm back. It's a new day. I got a goofy hat on and I don't have any fancy lighting, but I wanted to just let you know I just recorded a part 2 to this video, sort of a follow-up that directly addresses and gives feedback to one of the photos that I got back from one of my other editors. And I talk about a lot of important things about, better masking techniques, feathering, color cast, desaturation, address a few different topics that not only gives a better sense into my preferences, but also it will save him a lot of time, significant amount of time, compared to the approach that he took to solve a certain problem. And so who knows, maybe it could help you out as well and improve your workflow. So check out that video. It's about the same length as this video. And again, let me know if you guys have any questions or want clarification on anything, because I'm happy to help teach you guys and help you learn and improve at your craft, because if you're better and faster, then we all win. So talk to you soon.